Hello again, this is video lecture number 83. Today we are talking about fighting and winning the war. Our subsections are wartime aims and tensions, the war in Europe, the war in the Pacific, and finally planning the post-war world. So fighting in World War II took place on many fronts. Ordinary men braved extraordinary conditions in wartime Europe, from hedgerow to hedgerow, from street to street, as it was said. Albert Einstein eventually warned President Roosevelt in 1939 that it is conceivable that extremely powerful bombs of a new type may be constructed. And the dropping of 2 atomic bombs and the entry of the Soviet Union in the Pacific-Asian War brought about Japan's surrender in August of 1945. Today, we are going to be taking a very brief look at the overall strategies of World War II. We are not going to cover battles in detail or battle tactics. Instead, we are, again, taking a strategic view, which is what occurred in the conduct of the war at the national level. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started with fighting and winning the war with our first subsection, wartime aims and tensions. The Allied coalition was composed mainly of Great Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union, and their leaders, Winston Churchill for Great Britain, Roosevelt for the US, and Joseph Stalin for the Soviets. And they set the overall strategy, and we refer to these three as the Big Three. Churchill and Roosevelt's Atlantic Charter, as we learned before, formed the basis of the Allies' vision of the post-war international order. But Stalin had not been a part of that agreement, a fact that would later cause disagreements over its goals. The Soviets argued for opening a second front in Europe, preferably in France, because it would draw German troops away from Russian soil. In November 1943, Roosevelt and Churchill agreed to open that second front in return for Stalin's promise to fight against Japan when the war in Europe ended. Now, the delay in creating that second front, all the way to 1944, meant that the Soviet Union bore the brunt of the land battle against Germany. Stalin's mistrust then of the US and Great Britain from that carried over into the Cold War. So let's look at that war in Europe with our next subsection. During the first 7 months of the war, the Allies suffered defeats on land and sea in both Europe and Asia. The turning point of the war came when the Soviets halted the German advance in the Battle of Stalingrad. By 1944, Stalin's forces had driven the Germans out of the Soviet Union. In North Africa, Allied troops under the leadership of General Dwight D. Eisenhower and General George S. Patton defeated Germany's Africa Corps, which was led by General Erwin Rommel. The Allied command moved to attack the Axis then through Sicily and the Italian peninsula. In July 1943, Mussolini's fascist regime fell, and Italy's new government joined the Allies. The Allied forces finally entered Rome in June 1944, although the last German forces in Italy did not surrender until May of 1945. The invasion of France came on what we call D-Day, which was June 6, 1944, under General Eisenhower's command. More than 1.5 million American, British, and Canadian troops crossed the English Channel in the invasion of Normandy. In August of 1944, Allied troops helped liberate Paris. By September, they had driven the Germans out of most of France and Belgium. In December of 1944, the Allies eventually pushed the Germans back across the Rhine River in what's called the Battle of the Bulge, which was the final German offensive. As American, British, and Soviet troops advanced toward Berlin, Hitler committed suicide in his bunker on April 30th. Germany surrendered on May 8th of 1945. As Allied troops advanced into Germany, they came upon the extermination camps, where 6 million Jews, along with 6 million other people, were put to death. The Roosevelt administration had information about the camps as early as 1942. But so few Jews escaped the Holocaust because the United States and the rest of the world would not take them in. The War Refugee Board, which was established in 1944, eventually helped to save about 200,000 Jews who were placed in refugee camps in various countries. Factors that combined to inhibit U.S. action in this matter were anti-Semitism, fears of economic competition from a flood of immigrant refugees to a country that was honestly just recovering from the Great Depression, failure of the media to grasp the magnitude of the story and to publicize it accordingly, and the failure of religious and political leaders to speak out. Okay, so let's look at the war in the Pacific then with our next subsection. After Pearl Harbor, Japan continued its conquests in the Far East and began to threaten Australia and India. In May of 1942, in the Battle of the Coral Sea, American naval forces halted the Japanese offensive against Australia. And in June, Americans inflicted crucial damage on the Japanese fleet at the Battle of Midway. Over the next 18 months, General Douglas MacArthur and Admiral Chester Nimitz led the offensive in the Pacific. And they did that by advancing from one island to the next. We call this island hopping. Now, the reconquest of the Philippines began with a victory at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, in which the Japanese lost practically their entire fleet. By early of 1945, triumph over Japan was in sight, with costly American victories at Iwo Jima and Okinawa. The use of kamikaze missions, combined with Japanese refusal to surrender, suggested to American military strategists that Japan would continue to fight despite overwhelming losses. When Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin then met at Yalta in February of 1945, victory in Europe and in the Pacific was in sight, but no agreement had been reached on the peace to come. When Harry Truman took over the presidency, he learned of a top-secret project called the Manhattan Project, charged with developing the atomic bomb. It cost more than $2 billion and it employed 120,000 people. Truman ordered the dropping of atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima on August 6th and Nagasaki on August 9th. At the time, the belief that Japan's military leaders would never surrender unless their country was utterly devastated convinced American policymakers that they had to deploy the atomic bomb. 100,000 people died at Hiroshima and 60,000 died at Nagasaki. Tens of thousands more died slowly of the subsequent radiation poisoning that emanated from these bombs. Japan then offered to surrender on August 10th and signed a formal treaty of surrender on September 2nd, 1945. Okay, our last subsection then is planning the post-war world. One source of remaining conflict was Stalin's desire for a band of Soviet-controlled satellite states to protect the Soviet Union's western border. Roosevelt and Churchill agreed in principle on the idea of a Soviet sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. Roosevelt, though, pressed for an agreement that guaranteed self-determination for those nations and democratic elections, specifically in Poland and neighboring countries. But given the presence of Soviet troops there, Roosevelt had to accept a pledge from Stalin to hold free and unfettered elections at some future time. Germany then was to be divided into 4 zones to be controlled by the United States, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Berlin, the capital, would be partitioned also among those 4 nations. The Big Four made progress then towards the establishment of the United Nations. Its Security Council would include the 5 major Allied powers, plus 6 other nations participating on a rotating basis. And permanent members of the Security Council would have veto power over the decisions of the General Assembly. The United Nations was to convene then in San Francisco on April 25th, 1945. Roosevelt, though, suffered a cerebral hemorrhage, and he died on April 12th, 1945. Fascism had been defeated thanks to a strange alliance between the capitalist nations of the West and the communist power of the Soviet Union. The coming of peace would strain and then destroy this victorious coalition. Okay, so that concludes today's video lecture. Like I said, this is really a brief overview of the major strategies and the major movements of World War II. Go ahead now and answer your review questions and continue on with your notes.